Story 1. The thing about local legends is that it is extremely easy for them to get out of hand. In ancient times, legends were merely worshipped and passed religiously through generations. But nowadays, a viral tweet could start a local legend without any semblance of reliability, and it can turn into a whole phenomenon. Even a handful of decades ago, there were cases when means of communication popularized local legends like never before, for better or worse. Such is the case of Michigan's Dogman. For years, the people of the state wondered just how serious the local legend was. Just a coincidence? A prank from a radio DJ? Bored people coming up with stories to pass the time? Or perhaps the single darkest secret is hidden in the northwestern part of the state. The people of Michigan had many stances about the infamous Dogman. They were firm believers, obsessive fanatics, casual supporters, cautious people, skeptics, and passionate deniers of the legends. In order to study this phenomenon, in order to find the most significant stories that could bring this myth to life, none of those people actually matter as much as a final, very special group. The ideal and most important demographic is the people that are completely ignorant of the legend of the Dogman. People that have never heard about it and therefore haven't learned to search for or avoid the Dogman. This story begins with the clash between two very different people in very different states of belief. Jennifer was a woman in her 30s who agreed to temporarily move to Wexford County as a favor to a cousin. As it turned out, Jennifer's aunt suffered from dementia and couldn't live anymore. Her cousins, the poor woman's only daughter, had to leave the state for business for a month. She guaranteed Jennifer the job wouldn't be too difficult. The old woman didn't have too many health problems. She just needed someone around to make sure she didn't forget the meds or accidentally leave the house, get lost, or hurt herself. Jennifer already worked from home. She had no extremely demanding ties to her home or her city, and she was perfectly able to make her move to Michigan without disturbing her own life very much. She was glad to lend a helping hand to her cousin and her beloved aunt. She was so certain the biggest problem would be keeping up with her aunt's unreliable mind. Not for once did she suspect there were more troubling things surrounding the area, let alone any dangers lurking in the shadows at the edge of the old woman's property. The aunt had retired years ago to a beautiful house on the outskirts of an already peaceful and boring little zone. It was the perfect place for an old woman like her to grow old and rest for the last years of her life. Or so she thought. The house was big and gorgeous, but even more attractive were the gardens surrounding it, perfect for slow strolls through the rose bushes. It was a large property, right between two identical properties, and at the back, nothing but perfectly uninteresting wilderness, some unkempt woods that weren't hers to worry about. When Jennifer arrived at her aunt's house, she wasn't worried at all. She thought her job would be simple and perhaps even rewarding, if not enjoyable. She had known her aunt her entire life, and they had always had a good relationship. Plus, if she could enjoy that big house and those gorgeous gardens, she would be happy. But her plans were quickly ruined. Everything started going wrong since the very first night, when Jennifer woke up with a start, convinced she heard wild dogs barking, so close it was like they were on the side of her bed. But when the fog of sleep cleared, she immediately realized it was her aunt, confused and disoriented by her sickness, calling out from the bedroom down the hall. Jennifer sighed, got up quickly, and prepared to do her job. She went to her aunt's side and did her best to convince her that she was her niece, that they knew each other, she was home, and that she was safe. When the old woman calmed down considerably and her mind regained a semblance of clarity, Jennifer tried naively to add some levity to the situation. "You didn't have to bark to call me auntie," she said. But the look her aunt gave her raised goosebumps on her skin. The old woman looked angry, almost offended, worried for Jennifer, as if she were the one battling an illness. "That wasn't me," the old woman said with finality. "That was Mr. Dog." After that, she laid back down in bed, turned her back to Jennifer, and refused to say another word. She was asleep within seconds. Jennifer spent most of the entire day researching a little more about dementia, and she concluded that either her aunt used to have a dog that could have been called Mr. Dog, or maybe her mind prompted her to bark in the middle of the night for no reason at all. She couldn't be judgmental, and she couldn't let herself get thrown off by this. It was only the beginning. This exact series of events repeated itself almost every night for a week or so, slowly but surely becoming worse and worse. Every time Jennifer woke up with the sounds of barks, although sometimes it included wild howls, groans, heavy panting, and sometimes even human screams. Every time she attempted to ask her aunt about it at night or during the day, if she hadn't already forgotten, then she would insist it was Mr. Dog, the big dog, my neighbor dog. And yet, Jennifer knew for a fact that none of her neighbors owned any dogs. She wanted to believe it was just the old woman, a consequence of dementia. Maybe it was enough to turn her sweet, frail voice into the feral and guttural wails that Jennifer heard. But what about the nights when her aunt wasn't even calling her? Sometimes those awful sounds just woke Jennifer up. And when she checked on her aunt and the woman was soundly asleep, the young woman did the impossible to find logical explanations. But one night, one terrible and fateful night, everything changed. Once again, Jennifer woke up to the sounds of wild barking and one very human howl. She jumped out of her bed, half asleep, and went to check on her aunt, who wasn't in her room. She checked the bathroom, and before leaving to check the rest of the house, she thought about looking out the window. And there she was, her poor old aunt walking across the garden like a sleepwalker, a person that lost her mind. Jennifer ran out of the room, down the stairs and through the house. When she finally reached the garden, she realized why she was feeling so worried. This time, she was still hearing the barks and growls, and they were getting closer. Jennifer cried out and called her aunt's name desperately, but it was as if the woman was under a spell. Finally, Jennifer was to catch up to her right on the edge of the property, right in front of the dark and untrustworthy wilderness that waited on the other side. Jennifer quickly turned her aunt around, urged her to walk back home, and, seemingly half asleep, the old woman miraculously complied. But that wasn't the end, because when they started walking, the barking and howling stopped, but it was replaced by a hungry, heavy panting. Jennifer could almost feel an animal's hot, wet breath on the back of her neck. As it often happens, Jennifer made the mistake of looking back. She glanced over her shoulder for a second, but it was enough to leave her scarred forever. She quickly turned her head back toward the house. She walked as fast as she could, nearly dragging her aunt around. And she worked as hard as she could to erase that memory from her mind and convince herself that she didn't see that. She couldn't have seen that. That dog's head with shining red eyes standing well over 6 feet above the ground on a body that Jennifer, fortunately for her, had no chance to see. Story 2. Nobody likes to feel vulnerable. Truthfully, in one way or another, we're all very vulnerable creatures. Humans are exposed to danger every minute of their lives. The world is full of unexpected threats. Unlikely things like natural disasters or getting struck by lightning, and much more common problems like viruses and wild animals. And that's without even mentioning how often humanity attacks itself. Other people can be our greatest enemy or our best ally. But even if we're all vulnerable to so many dangers, we try our hardest to avoid getting into situations that make us even easier prey. This is something easier said than done for most people. For example, the way that just going out on the street is a risk for some minorities, or the way that most women around the world would be scared to go out alone at night. Still, people do it. They risk their lives every day. They make themselves vulnerable in order to live fulfilling lives. But the thing is, most people don't even consider all the dangers of this world, because there are more than natural threats and despicable humans going around. There are things in the middle, not really natural and not quite human. We're talking about some of the most dangerous creatures our world has seen, and that most people ignore, until their lives depend on it. In this case, the story revolves around a young woman that decides to leave her parents' house and move up north to an apartment of her own. Her name was Amelia, and she was making herself more vulnerable than ever before. But it was a risk she was willing to take in order to live her life to the fullest. She knew that living alone in an unfamiliar place put her at more danger than staying in her parents' house, but she didn't think it would be too bad. Amelia thought that she had to be careful about strangers, new neighbors, and getting lost. She knew she probably shouldn't go out alone at night, and be careful with who she became friends with. But these were all very normal things that most women like her experience quite often. It wasn't anything remarkable yet. So Amelia moved to her new apartment with her cat, a couple of boxes, and a lot of hope and optimism. She quickly befriended the old couple that worked as landlords of the small buildings, and she introduced herself to her mostly friendly neighbors. The only problem so far seemed to be just how aggressively her cat rejected the new home. When Amelia first arrived at the building, her cat turned unusually violent and reluctant to get out of the car. The poor animal hated the area at first sight. It calmed down considerably when Amelia let him inside the safety of her apartment. But all this progress was lost during the night. The first night at her new apartment could have been perfect, except for the cat's behavior. She had never seen her pet so agitated, nervous, and defensive. The animal paced the entire apartment, what felt like 100 times. But he always returned to the same window that looked from Amelia's apartment out onto the street, the road in front, and the unused land across the road. Those woods that went up a hill that Amelia considered as just a good view from her apartment. For the first week, Amelia tried to ignore her pet's strange attitude. Maybe the cat would just need time to get used to his new home. Even the fact that he was nervous and with his guard up and stayed awake most of the night just staring through the window, Amelia tried to ignore or explain all of it away. Until one night it became impossible to ignore. It was the first night she heard dogs barking nearby. The angry sounds woke Amelia up, but she could have perfectly ignored it. Dogs barked in the night everywhere in the world, right? There was just one thing that unsettled her enough to push her out of bed. Along with the barking, she was certain she heard a man screaming. That was a different problem. Someone could have been in grave danger. Amelia jumped out of bed with her cell phone in hand, ready to call the police if necessary. She acted on impulse. She went to the window facing the street and pushed it open to take a look at the street outside. She didn't see any man getting attacked by wild dogs, but barely a second after she leaned out to take a look, Her cat ran toward her like crazy and jumped through the window. It was so quick and urgent that it almost sent her stumbling to the floor. Amelia didn't waste another second in running out of her apartment and toward the street. Her pet was mostly a spoiled house cat. She wasn't sure he would survive on the outside, and if there were angry dogs nearby, she had to do what she could to protect her friend. Fortunately, she didn't have to go too far to find her cat, but that was as far as her luck went. Amelia found her cat on the street, facing the road that passed in front of the apartment and hissing angrily, more upset than she'd ever seen him. She was barely able to pick him up when he got distracted by a truck passing by on the road. But the truck had its lights on, and although they mostly blinded Amelia, they also illuminated the edge of the woods on the other side of the road. For one very quick and very terrible second, Amelia was able to see the giant face of a dog staring straight at her from across the road. She was so scared, so badly thrown off by those gleaming red eyes and the sheer size of those fangs that caught the light of the truck's headlights, that she didn't stop to take another look. She grabbed her cat tightly and ran all the way to her apartment, back to safety. Or so she thought. The problem was that Amelia could hide in her apartment as much as she wanted. She could pretend she didn't see anything that fateful night, or she could tell herself that it was a regular dog. But her story didn't end that night. It was only the beginning. As the days passed, the young woman and her cat settled into their new home and seemed to almost forget that horrible incident from the other night. Even the cat, still somewhat uneasy and constantly on edge, sometimes managed to relax and act as he usually did. He still spent most of his days glaring out of the window at the wild land beyond the other side of the road. Amelia accepted it as part of their new routine, and she secretly hoped to forget the events of the other night. She didn't imagine that they would repeat themselves quite so soon. It happened on an already difficult night. Amelia had had a stressful day at work. She was caught between arguing with her mother over the phone and making a messy dinner for herself, and everything was a disaster. She was distracted and clumsy, and the kitchen towel caught on fire. Amelia fumbled around to end the call, put out the fire, and turn off the stove, but it was too late. The food burnt and the fire alarm started blaring. She did her best to dissipate the fire, and unfortunately, that included throwing open the windows of her apartment. Amelia was barely starting to feel like the crisis was over when she realized her cat was nowhere to be seen. Luckily, Amelia knew exactly where to look for her cat. She ran out of her apartment, down the stairs, and out onto the street. She wasn't sure if she hadn't been paying attention or her cat's presence started at all. But now that she was outside, she was definitely hearing those aggressive dogs barking like crazy. She couldn't see them, but the sound was maddening enough to make her fear for her life. Finally, she saw her brave little cat standing in the middle of the road. Amelia made sure there weren't any cars coming, and she ran toward her beloved pet. This time, the cat wasn't hissing like before. This time, the little animal was scared out of its mind. Amelia picked him up, held him close to her chest, and almost dropped him again when she heard the next sound. That wasn't a dog. That was a man screaming. A man letting out an agonizing wail. Amelia got goosebumps. She felt a knot in her throat and she was frozen in place. She fell to the ground, still with her cat in her arms, and she looked up directly into the disproportionately large face of a dog that cried like a man. Amelia closed her eyes and waited for the worst. But then she heard a car's brakes screeching right next to her and a blinding light hitting her face. When Amelia opened her eyes, there was no sign of any dogs or men or anything in between coming at her from the woods on that side of the road. She was questioned and accompanied back home by a family traveling after the man driving was quick enough to put on the brakes before running her over. A week later, Amelie was back living in her parents' house and searching for apartments to live in, outside of Michigan. Story 3. On the subject of unfortunate encounters with despicable, dangerous creatures and entities, there are simply inevitable cases. We are talking about cases where the combination of bad omens is so terribly perfect, so greatly aligned with bad luck and dark forces, that it would have been just impossible for something terrible to not happen right there and then. Usually, when cruel and sorrowful things happen, the victims tend to wonder what they could have done differently, what different steps they could have taken. Anything that would have led them somewhere other than mere inches away from their tragic ending, the doors of hell, or the very face of the devil. These inevitable cases are opportunities where everything should have been done differently, but it wasn't. The result? Horrifying experiences that we now treasure as warning tales. This case in particular is one of those inevitable stories. The details of this specific case were pulled together by fate in a way that they couldn't have led anywhere else. These terrible coincidences were too many to be ignored by the magnetic pull of the darkness that is always vibrating underneath our seemingly normal and balanced world. Everything begins with a young man named Benny, who had the terrible luck of making every bad decision possible and repeatedly ended up at exactly the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. Benny lived his entire life in northwest Michigan with his parents and younger sister. Like most teenagers, he looked for ways to earn a little extra money to get by. Some boys mowed lawns, some washed cars. Benny was among the boys that walked their neighbors' dogs. But Benny had a fatal flaw: his impatience. He quickly realized that working faster meant more money in less time. This led him to have very little patience and kindness with the dogs he walked. There was never a very serious incident. He was never cruel. Not really. The dogs hated him, but he never crossed any lines that made him heartless or unforgivable. Still, the dogs despised him more than anybody else in the neighborhood. As he grew up and grew older, Benny gave up his business. But he also grew accustomed to all the dogs in the neighborhood barking angrily at him when he walked past their houses, trying to attack him when he crossed paths with owners when they were walking their dogs, just being aggressively hated by every canine everywhere he looked. Not that he cared very much. He was content as long as he had his money. When the time came to leave for college, Benny found himself in desperate need of extra money to take with him. He was juggling 2 part-time jobs around town already, but he believed he still had enough free time to earn just a little more. So, he had the unfortunate idea of returning to his dog-walking business. He wasn't particularly worried about the dogs' hatred for him. He had heard some of them had died or escaped their houses recently, and he had always been overconfident in himself, believing that the dogs were too dumb to hate the man holding the leash and getting them out of their houses for fresh air and distractions. This exact kind of hubris was about to be Benny's downfall. In the beginning, it looked like Benny wasn't completely wrong. Every dog he picked up barked aggressively at him at first, but as soon as the dogs understood that he was the man holding the leash for their daily walks, mostly they calmed down. Unsurprisingly, Benny went all out. He bit off more than he could chew. That day, Benny was walking 5 different dogs that disliked him at the same time. He chose to stay away from busy streets to avoid having witnesses in case the dogs embarrassed him. And he went late, around sundown, hoping nobody would see him. He didn't realize he was taking every single choice that would lead him down the worst possible path. The dogs were all uneasy and restless, of course, But Benny only started to worry when this changed. When they all approached the edge of the town, the dogs' attitude changed. They still looked on edge and offensive, but they weren't tugging Benny in many different directions. It was like they were following a secret path or answering a call that Benny couldn't hear. This became more and more obvious the more they walked. The dogs started tugging Benny forward almost desperately. He couldn't get them to change their mind no matter how hard he tried. They were stronger than him, and he would be in too much trouble if he let go of any of them. Where were they going? What was calling them? Was Benny losing his mind? Or did the dogs look as afraid as he was starting to feel? Benny couldn't help himself. He lost his calm. He called out to the dogs. "Stop! Stop! Please stop! What are you doing?" He called out to anyone that would listen to him. "Help! Is anyone there? Help! Anyone!" But it was all useless. The dogs turned out to be much stronger than him, and they dragged him away from the road and into the wild bushes by the side of the road. In seconds, Benny was stumbling and rolling down on the ground. He was overwhelmed by the sound of barking and growling and angry dogs all around him. He was covered in dirt, alone, scared, and scratched by the bushes and the rough ground. And then he heard the voices. Over the dogs growling around him, he heard people calling for him. "Is anyone there?" the stranger asked. And Benny tried to answer, but he couldn't form any words under the fear of pressing into his chest. He was curled up on the ground, surrounded by rabid dogs, while a group of strangers tried to find the unfortunate man that they distantly heard calling for help. And he couldn't say a thing. Why? He was unable to focus on anything other than one of the dogs, with one abnormally large, deformed by rage, head, looming over well above all the others, and searing itself in Benny's memory forever. Story 4. It is a very commonly known saying that goes, "Be careful what you wish for, because it might come true." Following this logic, we can assume any person looking for adventure will probably find it. But this comes at a price. You might never know just what kind of adventure you'd be signing up for. Real life isn't like a video game where people get to choose the difficulty before starting to play. In real life, when you take the risk of chasing an adventure, it is very likely you will end up with so much more than you bargained for. This is the case of a middle-aged man on the lookout for a new hobby, as it so often happens. But this man named Harold just so happened to stumble on the right hobby at the wrong time and place. He decided to pick up observation of wildlife as a hobby, and he didn't exactly want to move away from the state of Michigan in order to explore more exotic places. Harold was convinced he could find much beauty and excitement in his home state. This is where we pick up that same old phrase. He would get more than he bargained for. Harold started quite casually with his hobby, simply exploring parks and hiking trails close to him. But as he started to venture north of his home, he realized he was taking his hobby more seriously than expected. He had binoculars for bird watching. He had filled an entire notebook with sketches, and he was familiar with the species of animals that he was most likely to encounter at any given moment. Harold's problems began when he was taken by surprise for the very first time. He was a proud and confident man, and now that he had embraced his hobby, he wanted to be proud of it, and he refused to be made a fool of. So when Harold encountered a strange trail that didn't match any of his expectations, he didn't like the feeling of ignorance that came over him. He didn't like mysteries, and he made it his new purpose to uncover this mystery, follow this adventure, and discover what was waiting for him in the end. Since that day, Harold started to study that particular zone much more carefully. He was actually surprised to discover even more inconsistencies and mysteries than he had expected. Animals behaved strangely in that zone. Things simply didn't make any sense as they did everywhere else. Harold noticed that birds avoided that area as much as they could, and still, it was nothing compared to small animals from the ground. Little creatures such as foxes and rabbits and even squirrels acted downright terrified when they ventured to that part of the wilderness that Harold was studying. They weren't even close to civilization. What kind of unusual predator was hiding in the shadows? Harold perhaps shouldn't have asked so many questions. One thing led to another, and one question uncovered a bigger mystery. And soon enough, he wouldn't be able to untangle himself from it. He could have easily lost his mind overanalyzing that relatively small stretch of land. One day, Harold came across what looked like a human footprint. He obsessed over it so much at some point he even questioned if the footprint wasn't his. On another occasion, he became so certain that he had discovered the scene of a crime that he called the police. And the officers had to explore the zone even though they didn't find anything that matched Harold's deception of a man's agonizing cries coming from somewhere in the bushes. Finally, Harold was dragged even further down the rabbit hole of his obsession. He started to spend too much money on equipment. He was sure there was a very special animal, a mystery, or a great prize waiting for him at the end of this adventure. So he didn't hold himself back. He bought expensive cameras, flashlights, camouflage clothes, a tent, backpacks, boots, microphones, and even more cameras. It wasn't Harold's hobby anymore. This was his life. He spent most of his days obsessing over the secrets of that particular terrain. His notebooks were filled with sketches of human footprints that looked just a little off, just a little unnatural. He sent mysterious samples he picked up from the ground and trees around to laboratories in the city, until they banned him from showing up there at all. He collected hairs, bones, sharpened rocks, and every little thing that suggested there was something other than darkness living in that space. Through it all, however, Harold remained the skeptic and arrogant man he had always been. Sometime near the end, he felt like he was so close to finally collecting an undeniable piece of proof of the existence of a special animal living in those woods. If anything, the thing that saved him was his own skepticism and desire to be taken seriously, because it just so happened that Harold himself noticed how ominous and yet repetitive his pictures were starting to look. A blur here, some growing eyes there, a tall silhouette behind the trees, some kind of movement in the bushes. Those pictures weren't worth much, he knew, but that was also around the time he finally faced the real thing. Harold hadn't asked for this, not exactly. He had wanted a hobby, something meaningful to do with his life. And yet, that one particularly warm summer night, he almost lost his life entirely. His obsession blinded him. He lost track of time. He was only focused on following a trail of human-looking footprints on the damp, dark soil. He was trying to record every little step of his process, and the pictures in his camera would show splashes of blood here and there, bone peeking out from the ground, dark hairs beside the footprints, and then the final picture that Harold took before dropping his camera forever and choosing instead to run for his life. That picture showed the undeniable and unforgettable expression of utter human rage and fear, displayed in a completely feral face of a wild dog. Harold was fortunate that his picture didn't capture the body of the creature, even if his pictures were lost forever anyway. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I know there is a ton of content out there, and I'm sincerely appreciative for you watching this right through to the end. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and hit the like button. And if you don't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and select the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. Also, please leave a comment on this video letting me know what you thought of it. Comments really help with the YouTube algorithm and will really help my channel to grow. You can also let me know what type of videos you would like to see more of on this channel. That really helps me branch out into new subject matters. If you have a story you would like me to tell on this channel, please email it to me at stories@daredevril.com. If you want to support my channel even further, there are a number of ways you can do so. You can buy me a coffee via my Ko-fi account, or simply help me out by sharing my content with anyone you might think is interested in watching it. Thanks again.